Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear subscribers and listeners, I'd like to focus one more time on the Russian-Ukrainian war, but more specifically, the title today is Who is Ready to Make a Deal or to Sign Peace? My previous video was devoted to a discussion of negotiations, and the last session was in Abu Dhabi, and it appeared to be quite optimistic. It appeared to be that the high-level delegation went with military personnel, high-ranking military officers on the Russian side, and it looked like a serious discussion was going on, and that there were working groups formed, and they're supposed to meet in a few days on the 5th of February. But new clouds appeared on the horizon of these negotiations, and this is what I'd like to discuss today. The new element that has entered the picture is actually two. One is a possibility of a war in the Middle East, specifically the US and Israeli action against Iran. And in that case, everything is off. It's totally unpredictable what is going to happen and how it would affect the U.S. foreign policy and specifically war in Ukraine. So this is a total unknown. But there's another factor that has appeared in the last week or so, even though the mass media focused on it only in the last few days ago, but the trend was clear before that. And the trend is the decreasing approval rating of President Trump. And that is a big problem. Now, in political science and among historians, there is a term which sounds like Primat der Innenpolitik in German, which means the primacy of domestic policy. Over what? Over foreign policy. In other words, the domestic developments in a country do play a significant role in how it is playing out on foreign policy and foreign policy agenda. And so in this particular context, what is crucially important is to look at the latest data, and that is the approval rating of President Trump and by implication the Republican Party, and how that can, well, first of all, what are the figures, and then how these figures can influence the behavior and the policy agenda of the key players. And in that case, this is Ukraine, Russia, and to some extent the Europeans, the European Union. So the data are that President Trump's approval rating has decreased to its lowest, and there are various polls. There's Pew poll and Gallup poll and ABC poll and all kinds of other ones, but essentially it has come down to about 37%. Some of them are lower than that, and that is the lowest it has been ever in President Trump's case, but it also is lower than at a comparable time it was with President Obama and the preceding ones, Bush and others. In other words, it's quite low at that time. Now, the reasons for that are obviously, is the American media explains it quite well. The reasons, of course, are the cost of living, which has increased because of inflation, and that in turn was increased by the tariff wars of all kinds and the instability of prices, and finally some of these tariffs stayed, and that has a negative impact on the markets and on the prices. And the second one was the recent one could say scandal or outcry over the killing of two American citizens by the ICE agents in Minnesota. And it seems to me that Trump has not expected such a huge impact. But all the opinion polls show that it is a big impact, and that even though most people support his strict control of immigration and the closing of borders, the majority of Americans, about 60%, consider that the ICE just went too far. And these are violations of civil rights and this kind of a rough treatment of Americans protesting ICE, which they have a full right to do. And when those ended with the killing of two white citizens in Minnesota, is quite unusual. In fact, unprecedented. One could only think back in the days of Vietnam War when something like that happened, when there were deaths from the action of police. So, because of this, there's a lot of discussion in American press as to what is going to happen in November, and there are predictions, and some of them are quite convincing, that the Republicans may lose the control over the Congress. Now, here's some statistics. Since World War II, the president's party has lost House seats in 18 out of 20 midterm cycles, with an average loss of about 27 seats when approval is below 50%. Now, when the approval is less than 35%, the result on elections could be quite significant. So analysts project a high likelihood of Republicans losing their House majority, with the estimates of 20 to 40 seats lost if approval rating stays low. This could flip the House to the Democrats, enabling investigations or blocking Trump's agenda. And that is the key. This is the key premise here in our discussion of how it may affect foreign policy, and specifically Russian-Ukraine war. Now, those of you who are not familiar with American Constitution, the Congress has enormous powers, even though Trump had been ignoring those. But nevertheless, the Congress votes on the budget, and it has all kinds of rules and procedures that it could stop Trump's capacity to act. And this is what happened under President Obama, when Republicans pretty much made him a lame duck president, as the expression goes. In other words, unable to pass any legislation. So loss of the Congress to the Democrats would be very, very painful blow to President Trump and to the Republicans and to their agenda and to their possibilities in the next presidential cycle, which is crucial for Trump agenda to be fulfilled, because it cannot be fulfilled in 4 years. So how will that all play out, and how do the Ukrainians and the Russians view this new factor, which was not on their horizon just a couple of months ago? Now, the Ukrainian media on the whole tends to interpret this as positive for Ukraine. In other words, those who are for Zelensky, and there are not a lot of those people in Ukraine, but the governing elites, they view that Trump has been pushing them to accept what he calls a deal or a compromise, but a concession to the Russians. And that means that if there is a result in elections that would weaken Trump and strengthen the Democrats, the Ukrainian observers, not all Ukrainian, I mean pro-government Ukrainian observers, think that that is good for Ukraine. Well, I don't want to put it this way. It's not good for Ukraine. It's good for the ruling circles of Ukraine. Now, of course, there is opposition, and there are all kinds of opposition figures. Some of them want a union with Russia. Some of them are different in terms of nationalism, but replacing Zelensky. That's Zaluzhny and company, and Poroshenko, and others such as Arestovich. They basically feel that their position is that Ukraine should give up Donbass and sign the treaty on Russian terms, accepting such demands as neutral status and the restoration of the rights of Russian language and the Russian Orthodox Church. And they still believe, Arestovich does, and those who support him, that Ukraine can recover, can join European Union, and can have more than 2/3 of its territory, and that's good enough to stop the war and to stop the death of so many Ukrainian soldiers. But nevertheless, we're not talking about opposition, the official establishment, and that explains their view, and their view is to procrastinate, to postpone any deal without antagonizing Trump. And that is what Zelensky is doing. He keeps on saying that we agree on 90%, we agree on the 100%, we agree on everything, but he hasn't signed anything. And moreover, his rhetoric is quite harsh. That is to say that his newly appointed Minister of Defense openly, in a public speech, said that the Ukrainian drone operators should aim at killing 50,000 Russian soldiers per month. That is quite arrogant, and that's not something that one would say if one were ready to sign a peace agreement with the opposing side. So also Zelensky keeps talking about the 100% deal with the United States, which means some kind of guarantees. Now, but Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, says that they haven't even seen what these guarantees are. And of course, no of these guarantees would be valid without the consent of Russia, because the conflict is with Russia, and they have to come to a common denominator as to what security guarantees for Ukraine would look like. It would be a part of the package. Now, those of you who want to focus on that issue, let me just say that what the Ukrainians and the Russians agreed in April 2022, when they were signed the agreement that could have put the end of this horrible war, the security guarantees were to be provided by the Security Council, which means 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus 2 other parties such as Germany and I think Turkey, who would be the guarantor powers, and each one of those countries would have veto power over any decisions concerning fulfillment of the assigned agreement and other things as well. Anyway, so this is where the Ukrainian reaction to it. Now let me move on to the Russian reaction. The Russian press actually is quite fearful of the democratic gains, and the consensus is that the Russian coverage tends to suggest that it would be better for Moscow if Trump and the Republicans kept the majority as they have, and by the same token, if the Democratic Party gained over Republicans, this could hurt Russian interests and could jeopardize any peace agreement and could escalate into another level of confrontation, which means there could be again raised an issue of tomahawks and of military assistance and escalation that could get out of control and so on. So the Russian media in its majority, tends to view this as a serious problem that Trump's popularity is down, that his approval rating is down, that the chances of the Democrats to win are high. But the conclusion that is made is quite different. The majority of state-supporting media seems to be inclined more to the conclusion that one should make a deal now before it's too late. One should exploit this historical window of opportunity and using Trump's good graces to come to a compromise. However, that's not universal, and there's a great presence in Russia of a desire to continue the war until victorious end. The quite reliable Levada Center of Public Opinion, which is respected highly even in the West, suggests that 60% of Russians want to continue the offensive in case a good compromise cannot be reached. And by good compromise, they mean that Russian conditions should be met. Now, in the West, the Russian conditions are called maximalist. Now, these are not maximalists. The cessation of the Donbass, only 4 provinces, and Crimea, and neutral status for Ukraine, and no NATO, no foreign troops, is not a maximalist position. The maximalist position is regime change and is taking Kiev and installing a government friendly to Russia. That would be the maximalist position. So as long as Russia now agrees to what would be a minimalist position, the one that doesn't require all of those, that is still possible. But the majority of Russians, if that fails, if the negotiations do not come to this current level of demands, they support continued offensive into the until these ends are met. And what I think it's very remarkable is that in the latest interview, Foreign Minister Lavrov made it quite clear that it's not a matter of territory. It's not a matter of just, as the Western press says, to come to a compromise on the territory. He explicitly said that Russia does not want to have a Zelensky regime in power, which suggests that a part of the deal could require new elections, and the new elections indeed open to all. And that also is insurmountable obstacles with 5 million Ukrainians living in Russia and 5 million of Ukrainians living in Western Europe. How to organize these elections and how this could be a part of a peace settlement, these are big questions. But the fact that Lavrov mentions this suggests that Russia is not ready to just sign a compromise and that's it. Zelensky stays in power, this regime stays in power and keeps on dreaming about joining NATO and so forth. So it seems to me that if we ask a question, who is ready to sign peace on the current terms? And the answer is no one. Trump is weak in a sense that he cannot force Zelensky to sign anything. He certainly cannot force Putin to sign anything. And it seems that public opinion in both, in Ukraine and in Russia, is more prepared to wait and see unless something could be done quickly in the Russian case. And that means that the chances of this being resolved within the next foreseeable weeks is very, very low. And that's it for today, my dear friends. I want to remind you that I just published a part of a series on my biography, which is in personal narratives playlist. And I invite you to look at my other playlists on Soviet history, on post-Soviet history, on Russian history, European history, and personal narratives. And I invite you to read my book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin. And I will see you soon with another edition of Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Goodbye.